So let's get into the spinal cord as well as spinal nerves. So we've kind of talked about the nervous system a little bit. So we have, a familiarity with the different structures, but let's get into the specifics. So the spinal cord, as we know, is part of the central nervous system. There's about 100 million neurons and then even more neuroglial cells that compose the spinal cord. Absolutely crazy. The spinal cord is pretty interesting. When we have talked about the spinal cord and how things move through the nervous system, we've talked about how we'll sense things with our nerves, right? The PNS, the peripheral nervous system. It'll send it to the spinal cord depending on where it is in the body. And then it'll go up the spinal cord, it'll get integrated in and processed in the brain, and then it'll come back down the spinal cord and it'll relay that information to the nerves that will integrate wherever this skeletal muscle is that we need to activate, right? So it's just kind of like a rough understanding of how the spinal cord kind of works. But it's actually this spinal cord's a little bit more complicated than that. It's not always going to the brain. Okay, so that's fun. So this word integration that we use, integration, it really just means processing these action potentials, which we've talked about, neurotransmitters and sending those signals, right? So sensory to the brain to the motor, but again, we can bypass the brain. And when we do that, we see in the spinal cord, it can have its own integration, and that'll be seen as these reflexes, so spinal cord reflexes. And so typically when we think of like a reflex, we think of like a knee-jerk reaction or something. That's kind of just like a common phrase that we use. Or, there's that you're at the doctor's office and your legs are, hanging off the table, and they use that tiny little hammer and they kind of hit below your knee. What they're hitting is the patellar tendon, and you'll have this patellar reflex, and it will, make your leg kind of kick out, make your leg extend at the knee. That's the patellar reflex. That's all going to be processed by the spinal cord. So it's these quick and these automatic responses to these specific stimuli. And it's just being integrated right there in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Okay. Of course, the white matter, right? The white matter with, the axons of the neuron is, where we can see that sensory signal being relayed up to the brain, and then the motor signal coming back down. And then it can go out one of these routes, one of these routes to the spinal nerve, and then it goes to the location in the body that it needs. Okay. So, really interesting with the spinal cord. In this video, we're going to be talking about just kind of the gist of the spinal cord, some basic structures, looking at it from a few different views, looking at some transverse cuts, as well as the protective structures of the spinal cord. All right. So, let's just take a moment and kind of realize where we are in the body. Okay, so the spinal cord is, of course, continuous with the brain stem, right? So it leads into the medulla oblongata, which we'll talk about later in another chapter. But what's surrounding the spinal cord, right? The spinal cord itself is going to be traveling through that vertebral foramina of the vertebrae, right? So there's that hole in each vertebrae, creating the vertebral column that allows the spinal cord to pass through all the way up to the brain. All right. So if I were to ask you, where is it located? We got to think about the cavity of the body, right? So it'd be the vertebral cavity. What is it specific? What structure is it specifically flowing through? That's the vertebral foramina, excuse me. That's formed via, that hole in the vertebrae, and then the vertebrae are stacked on top of each other. So we have to, understand and visualize that vertebral column. All right. Now, on top of the bones protecting the spinal cord, we also have something called meninges. And meninges there's three of them, and they are these protective layers of connective tissue that are continuous around the spinal cord and the brain. So we'll come back to these as well, but we'll introduce them in this chapter. And then, real quick, before we progress anywhere else, I do want to talk about something called cerebrospinal fluid, which again, we'll talk about more when we get to the brain, because this fluid, cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF, is created in the brain. It circulates around the brain as well as the spinal cord. So we'll talk about it again when we get to the brain. But just to introduce it, it is a liquid. It is more of like a plasma. It's essentially blood plasma, but it has a little bit different constituents. It has different ions. It's got glucose and whatnot. So the purpose of CSF, again, it's circulating the entire central nervous system, and so it's actually going to be helping with protection as well as regulating the chemical environment of the nervous system, the CNS. And then it does get drained into the circulatory system, and then we just continuously make cerebral spinal fluid, and it continuously gets circulated and then drained. All right, but it is technically a type of protection for the spinal cord as well as the brain. We will talk about this way more. I just wanted to briefly talk about it because CSF, the cerebral spinal fluid, is on some of these imagery, and we will talk about it a little bit when we introduce some spaces. So I just wanted to give just a little overview of what that actually means. Okay. So just looking at some of these imagery, right, we can see we have a vertebrae right here. So we can see a nice, protective bone around that. We can see that it does have these nerves, these spinal nerves, where an anterior root and a posterior root fuse together, and then it becomes a spinal nerve that leaves the vertebral column. It leaves the vertebrae through the intervertebral spaces, right? The intervertebral foramens. Okay. And then it'll go and integrate, wherever it needs to in the body. So just to be aware of that. Okay. We can see the spinal cord in here, but there's a lot going on. We have all of these different layers and spaces and fluids. Before we progress to the next slide, I do want to talk about the epidural space. Okay, the epidural space. So the first layer of meninge, right, the first protective connective tissue surrounding the spinal cord is called the dura mater. Okay, so epidural is going to be outside of that, and it's actually this cushion of fat between the vertebrae and the dural layer, the dura mater. Okay, and it's just going to be a cushioning if all else fails with those protective layers. So the epidural space is between the vertebrae and the dura mater, and it's going to be just a cushion of fat between those, between the actual organ and the bone. Okay. So here we can see, this is a really clear view of the, a transverse section of the spinal cord, as well as the actual dural matter, the actual meninges, the different matters, some blood supplies, and the actual spinal nerves. We're going to talk about all of these imagery as we talk about each layer, okay? But these are just good summary imagery. So if you wanted to come back to that, you can. Quick reminder, though, when we're looking at a transverse section of the spinal cord, we do need to, just kind of visualize it and remember that the gray matter is going to be on the inside and the white matter is going to be on the outside. Remember that white matter is going to be primarily composed of your myelinated axons, and then your gray matter is going to be your cell bodies and dendrites. Okay. Also, anytime you look at a spinal cord, I would get into the habit of identifying posterior versus anterior, or dorsal versus ventral. Okay. So on the posterior side, you have something called the posterior median sulcus. So a sulcus is just kind of like a shallow groove. Okay. And then on the anterior side, you have the anterior median fissure, and that is going to be a large indentation. So it's really clear the fissure is on the anterior side, the shallow groove is the sulcus is on the posterior side. That'll help you out with naming the different parts of the spinal cord and understanding how information is moving in and out of the spinal cord. Okay. So let's get into our meninges. Okay. So the first most, outermost layer. Okay. So this is the most superficial layer. This is called the dura mater. Okay. And it literally translates, I think maybe German, but it translates to tough mother. Okay. This is the toughest, the thickest, the strongest layer of connective tissue. It is specifically made out of dense, irregular connective tissue. All right. And again, all of these meninges are going to be continuous within the, surrounding the spinal cord and the brain. Okay. The dura mater is also going to be continuous with the epineurium, which is the outer covering of the spinal and cranial nerves. So if we actually go back to one more slide, two more slides, we can actually see that we have this dura mater, and that's actually going to be this layer right here. And you can see that that's going to be also covering portions of that spinal nerve. Okay. Now, after the dura mater, you have vertebrae, then the epidural space, and then the dura mater, and then you have subdural space. Okay, so subdural space is sometimes seen there and sometimes it's not, but it's essentially this space that's deep to the dura mater, and it's right before the next layer of meninge. Okay. The next layer of meninge is going to be called arachnoid mater. Okay. And yes, that does mean spider. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay. So we can see, though, again, we have that epidural space right here. We have the dura mater and the arachnoid mater on this cadaver spinal cord combined. So we're not actually able to see the subdural space. Okay. But here we can see the dura mater and then the arachnoid mater, and then you have that subdural space in between. Okay. Now the purpose of this subdural space is, there may be interstitial fluid kind of flowing through this. Okay. And again, it's just going to be another protective, cushioning, reducing friction and helping with, eliminating waste and whatnot. But it also does help kind of, protect the spinal cord. All right. Then we have the arachnoid mater. Okay. And also pay attention to the spelling here, right? Because it's very different from gray matter and white matter, right? That actually is matter, right? So it has two T's. These are meninges, so these are maters, and they only have one T. So keep that in mind. Okay. So now we have the arachnoid mater, which, yes, it means spider. Okay. But it's named this way because the arachnoid mater is actually composed of collagen and elastic fibers kind of loosely arranged, and it almost makes like this spider web appearance And so you can kind of see here in this 2D image the arachnoid matter, and then you have like these spider webs kind of flowing through here, right? So that's going to be, these collagen and elastic fibers just kind of delicately arranged, giving it this spidery appearance. Okay, so to me, it's probably the most easily, rememberable meninge because it's arachnoid. It looks like a spider web. Okay, but it is avascular, just to point out, and it is again made of collagen and elastic fibers. Okay, so on this image of the cadaver, I think it's really clear here that we can see the dura mater and how thick it is, and that's why it's so strong, and it's that outer layer protection. It's like the skin for the spinal cord. Okay, and then we have that potential subdural space here, the arachnoid matter, and then after the arachnoid matter, you have subarachnoid space. Okay, so subarachnoid space is actually going to contain cerebrospinal fluid, which is going to help with shock absorption. So let me go back to here, and we can see the arachnoid mater here, and we can see, those spider-like projections coming off of it, and the subarachnoid space where we have all of this blue cerebrospinal fluid flowing to, again, help with shock absorption and help protect the spinal cord and keep it kind of in place. Okay? And so I know that this is an image of the brain, but again, all three of the meninges, the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and then finally the pia mater, are all continuous with the brain and the spinal cord. So no matter where you're looking at it, it's all going to have the same features. Okay. And so lastly, we have the pia mater, which is directly on the organ, right? So it's directly on the spinal cord and the brain. It is the deepest, it's very thin, it's transparent, but it is connective tissue still. Okay, so like here in this image, you're just looking at the brain, but really what you're looking at is pia mater. Okay. So it is connective tissue, but it is going to have some squamous and cuboidal cells that kind of interlace with collagen fibers and again some elastic fibers. Okay. Now, pia mater is actually vascularized, so it is going to help with that direct supply of oxygen and nutrients to the spinal cord and the brain. Now, the most thing that most different characteristic of pia mater versus the other ones is something called denticulate ligaments. Okay, so denticulate ligaments are actually these portions of pia mater that are thicker. Okay, and they are going to project laterally off of the spinal cord, and they're going to fuse with the other meninges. They'll fuse with the arachnoid mater. They'll fuse with the dura mater, more so the inner surface of the dura mater. And then they kind of anchor the spinal cord in place, just in case that, there was some type of, fall on the body and some type of major disturbance where the spinal cord gets, displaced almost, some type of shock to the vertebral column. The denticulate ligaments are actually going to assist in stabilizing. Okay, so we can see the denticulate ligaments here coming off of the pia mater. So pia mater, again, is transparent. So when you get thicker pia mater together to form that ligament, it's almost kind of cloudy just because you're piling and piling on some of that pia mater. Okay, so we can see, these rootlets of the spinal nerve. Okay, we've kind of maybe seen them on a few other images as well. Let's go back a little bit, right? Like here. Okay, Some students do confuse those rootlets with the denticulate ligaments, but the denticulate ligaments are deeper. Those rootlets can connect to the dura mater on the external side. The denticulate ligaments are deep, deep onto the actual spinal cord, because they are a product of pia mater, and pia mater is the deepest meninge. All right. Where's that one image? I do like it on this image, so you can see it kind of coming off the pia mater, which is again directly onto the spinal cord on the organ, and you can see it kind of gets thicker, and it does fuse and stabilize laterally.